With the easing of restrictions in several countries, economic analysts are constantly looking at how different economies and markets will respond to the post-COVID-19 pandemic in order to overcome the anticipated recession in most countries. Other questions being asked include how will developed, emerging, and developing economies respond to the post-pandemic era. Are there economies and markets that are immune to these pressures? And of course, is circular economy the answer to Africa's and indeed Nigeria's economic crisis in this era of COVID-19? Joining us now from Canada to discuss all of that is Dr. NATALIE BEINISCH, co-founder, Circular Economy Innovation Partnership. She's also the executive director of Growing Business Capital in Lagos, where she's responsible for facilitating the development of sustainability-related ecosystems in Nigeria. Before moving to Lagos, she ran the engagement program for Aegon Asset Management's Responsible Investment Team in the Netherlands and headed the academic network at the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment in London. Dr. BEINISCH, good morning and welcome to the Morning Show.
Good morning.
Morning, Dr. BEINISCH.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let me ask you quickly, circular economy in a post-COVID-19 context. What is the difference between circular economy and a linear economy? And why is one more favorable than the other?
Well, I would say, simply put, circular economy is really a way of eliminating waste from economic activity. If you think about a linear economy, or the current economy that we work in, about 90% of the goods that are manufactured are turned into waste. They're not recycled. So really, circular economy is just that. It's a way of reducing that amount of waste that is put out in our environment. And really, sorry, it's 3 a.m. here in Canada. The operationalization of circular economy is really based on policies that price waste and business models that are built on eliminating and reusing waste through the value chain. In terms of why it's important, well, I think it's attractive for 2 reasons, and the first is really an ecological issue. Before the COVID pandemic, we had a climate problem, and really that was very, very high up on our agenda. But of course, COVID has taken over as a central issue, but it hasn't meant that the climate has disappeared. It's still a problem. And then we have an economic issue. If you have so much waste going out into the environment, there is a value and there's a cost to this. So I think what circular economy promises is a way to create more value from that.
Thank you, Doctor. There's a lot that's been made of when will life return to normal after the pandemic and what have you. But can you talk to us about how and why we shouldn't return to normal? And what are the practical ways that we can start to implement theories and principles from your circular economy model?
Yes, I mean, again, I think I just mentioned it. I think really prior to the pandemic, global warming or climate change was really top on the agenda, and there's been concerns, with the Paris Agreement to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, where with most best case scenarios seeing that might not happen, and current climate scenarios really forecasting scenarios of around 3 to 5 degrees, which in a Nigerian context, given that it's a coastal area, it's combined with desert is really means some dreadful outcomes. So we don't want to go back to creating environment where there's more emissions and more waste. I think this is an opportunity really where, particularly in OECD countries, where you have much more government involvement, to start to pivot towards these kinds of principles, which advocate for the elimination of waste in the economy. In terms of doing that, I think there's two principal ways of doing that. One, as I mentioned before, is sound policy, market-oriented policy that puts a price on that waste. And I think that's been done really effectively in the European context. And there's certainly ground to move forward in the Nigerian context. For example, Nigeria is implementing extended producer responsibility legislation, which means that larger manufacturers and larger companies have a responsibility for their end-of-use waste as well. I think then, in addition to that, we need to work with businesses on developing new types of business models. I think these kinds of business models are centered around sharing platforms, goods as a service rather than as a product itself. I think this relies on a lot of coordination within the supply chain. And again, in a Nigerian context, you would see this really in terms of more cooperation between the formal and the informal sector.
All right. I've got two questions. Number one, how can local entrepreneurs be part of the circular economy in terms of waste renewal? We've seen the work the likes of Recyclers is doing, but I'm saying waste renewal in a more ecological tone and in a more ecological understanding. Take, for instance, the eastern part of the country is inundated with a lot of ecological challenges. How can we see more local entrepreneurs going to that market? Then secondly, I want you to talk a little bit about markets like carbon seeding and how, we can integrate that into, this circular economy, because we've got a lot of lush forest and the likes. How can we integrate markets like carbon seeding and be able to build a viable economy out of it?
I think those are both really, really good questions. I think I'll give some examples, maybe in terms of how this would work from an industry perspective, and hopefully that answers its questions. But if it doesn't, then please do feel free to answer follow-up questions. I think in terms of integrating local entrepreneurs, I think there's really the way that the Circular Economy Innovation Partnership is starting from this is working with large-scale businesses who have some kind of a regulatory obligation through EPR or their own internal objectives to meet or to reduce waste within their company. So, for example, Unilever, which has been working with Growing Business Foundation, it's using its distribution channels for its entrepreneurs who are distributing across Nigeria to then turn that so that it's collecting waste through those same channels. Again, you mentioned Recyclers. They will be partnering with Recyclers, but that creates a new stream of revenue. I think it connects entrepreneurs to larger businesses, and it creates really more opportunity to move forward. In terms of carbon seeding, I think that's quite a technical area which I'm not that familiar with, but I would give you an example of through a supply chain how this could work. So if you're looking at, for example, in cement manufacturing or or where there's some kind of mining or other kind of initiative which is taking from natural resources, I think within that there would be some kind of there's a ecological there's some kind of replanting or way of regrowth that then is sort of transferred to somebody else in terms of developing those kinds of areas. So I think those are the two sort of more concrete examples that I could give in terms of your questions.
Well, earlier on you talked about market-oriented policies. You also referred to regulation. Would you like to comment further on that, particularly whether there will be need for legislation to be able to have the kind of resource efficiency that is at the heart of a circular economy? And is it possible to have a 100% circular economy? Is it not the case that what will work for most countries, particularly emerging markets, will be a combination of both the circular model and the linear model?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to answer your last question first, I think it's a stretch target to get to a circular economy, but I think it's one of those areas that it's almost once you mobilize, then it becomes more important. I think key in the Nigerian space again is, yes, legislation is important. Again, it's creating the kind of frameworks that make the business model. I think what we've seen in Europe, there are business models that work, as I said, goods as a service or sharing platforms that makes those possible to move forward. I think, again, as I said, I think the major challenge in terms of implementing this in Nigeria is that it does require a high level of coordination between both market actors, state actors, and across informal sector. And I think that's something that the institutional coordination within Nigeria would limit how fast you could actually implement circular economy models.
You didn't answer the part about legislation.
Sorry?
The part about, Dr. Abati, your question about
legislation.
Yes.
You haven't yet addressed that. I said, what kind of legislation would be useful?
So, for example, I think one case, if we can, the extended producer responsibility legislation, which makes producers responsible for their own for the end-of-use waste, is one example in the Nigerian context. If you look at the EU, what the EU has done is effectively organize market actors to determine how they would build a circular economy themselves, how they would remove waste from their supply chain themselves, and to effectively self-regulate and to threaten more stringent regulation should they not succeed in greening a roadmap. So there's sort of two models there. Is a state-based...
Dr. BEINISCH, sorry to interrupt you. We need to take a quick commercial break and then we'll come back to you. Please stay with us.
Great.
Welcome back to the morning show right here on Arise News. And we've got Dr. NATALIE BEINISCH, co-founder, Circular Economy Innovation Partnership. Tunu, you got a question, right?
Yes, I do. So a lot has been made, and it's COVID-19 pandemic has really shown up hygiene challenges and limitations that we have, especially in a developing country like Nigeria. Can we talk about how a circular economy and waste minimization can help, with some of our sustainable development goals in the areas of hygiene, water, and what have you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's a paradox of this crisis is that you're seeing much more use of disposable products, and really based on health and safety reasons. So I think the short answer is that it's really hard to. You have to solve the short-term crisis before the long-term crisis. So, but the main way of working around this is to look at this in terms of an entrepreneurial opportunity. And I'd mentioned Growing Business Foundation earlier, and that's one of their initiatives is again collecting the waste from PPE equipment and working to recycle it again, creating a new kind of income stream for people who are receiving it across the country.
All right, I want to talk about single-use plastic and how they could be big money spinners for this economy, probably a sizable ecosystem of single-use plastic that can even add, to our national GDP and add a sizable percentage. Because currently they're a big problem. There were photos on social media, dated on social media recently about a situation, I think somewhere around Surulere, where it rained and you had a lot of PET bottles and single-use plastics, covering the drainages and gutters and the likes. And it's a big challenge for us now. But how can we turn that to wealth?
Yeah, I think that's it's a big challenge, and I agree. It's really heartbreaking to see the amount of plastic waste that's around Lagos, especially in the water systems, and it affects it affects food supply, it affects sanitation, and I mean the list can go on. I think there's multiple ways of addressing that problem. I mean, the first and simplest is improving collection systems. And again, the model that CEIP has adopted to move forward in this is to work with larger companies to identify their problems related to the extended producer responsibility initiative and otherwise to begin to develop collection systems so that waste can be recycled into different kinds of products. For example, bricks, you could have waste to plastic to fuel. There's, I think, many different kinds of uses for those kinds of plastics. But I think the second, I'm just facilitating this ecosystem. I'm not the entrepreneur that has the ideas. So I think it's up to us to set up the framework to create those problems. And I think that's something that's the entrepreneurial spirit within Lagos and Nigeria more broadly works to sort of identify different kinds of solutions to turn that kind of plastic into new products. I should also add, I think that technology is really important here as well. So using new materials, different kinds of materials instead of alternatives to plastic for packaging, exploring whether you need packaging in the first place as well. Those competencies aren't necessarily found in Nigeria, but I think circular economy partnership. It has links to, global leaders who have been working on this within Europe, but specifically in Finland. And so I think combining those kinds of talents, the entrepreneurial talent and those technical talents can really achieve some really great results.
Well, I mean, waste to wealth is important to increase efficiency and reduce, certain other challenges that we face. But how about the money side of it? If you look at a developing economy like Nigeria, we don't even have recycling plants. We don't have a sewage system. In many parts of the country, as you must have discovered, waste management is not something that the governments take seriously. Now, how much will it cost in terms of setting up the infrastructure and also getting the public sector, government, political leaders to understand the importance of greater management of waste, resource efficiency, and all the associated points?
Yeah, the costs are huge. I can't agree more fully with your points. It's a huge challenge. Setting up the infrastructure to collect and to recycle waste. There isn't really a public infrastructure. I should say Lagos, within the Lagos system, there's some infrastructure, but I'm going to just stop and say I don't want to put a cost on this because this really isn't my area of expertise, but it's an enormous amount. But I think where we're at right now is that you have to look at government as steering instead of rowing. So they're not necessarily setting up the infrastructure themselves. It's about setting up policy that prices waste in a relevant way that makes it more attractive for people to collect it and to turn it into a different kind of product. So the incentives, I think, are critical from the government standpoint. And I think from there, you could see, especially working with larger organizations within the Nigerian context, to see a greater level of coordination in terms of collection and disposal and recycling of waste.
Thank you, Doctor. I mean, we've seen the fragility of so many of the systems we've come to rely on, like in Nigeria with our monoproduct economy. We saw how the pandemic affected oil prices. We've seen inequality widening as a result of redundancies, you know, the kind of poverty, the kind of suffering that's been occasioned by this pandemic. I want to go back to my earlier question. I'd like you to expand a little bit. What are some of the concrete things that we can do to address these social problems using some of the circular economy models?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think you're right. We're in it's just like a crisis like, anything we've ever seen before. And I think in your point around oil dependency is really important. In terms of sort of I can address your question really from a theoretical standpoint first, which is or a conceptual standpoint, which is that circular economy, when you look at it compared to sustainability or CSR, the main tenet of circular economy is that it's about creating growth. It's about creating jobs by using different kinds of by using waste. And I think when you talk about waste products, so for example, as I was talking use of plastic, like plastic to fuels, turning plastic into bricks or other kinds of products, then that's where you can see some kind of diversification within the economy. Again, there's the institutional angle, which is that once you create these institutional frameworks that price waste and that create greater incentive for coordination between the formal sector and the informal sector, there's really more opportunity to build the economy.
Right, very well said.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett.